Yes, okay, so it's recording. So hello everyone, I'm Luis Pessoa, and this is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon, where we gather once in a while, every few weeks, sometimes every few months, to discuss ways in which we can enhance the communication between philosophy and neuroscience, consider neuroscience from a more conceptual theoretical standpoint, and also try to inform or make bridges, create bridges with philosophy and conceptual thinking in terms of the kinds of problems that experimental scientists care about, worry about. And today we have a fantastic discussion lineup for discussion, because a few weeks ago in the series that is organized by Roberto and Katia, I think it's called Brain Web, right? In the Brain Web series, Matteo gave a presentation about the work with Alvaro Moreno on biological autonomy. It's a work that is in a book that many of you probably have read, and if you haven't, make sure that you do, because it's really a fantastic, incredible book. And that event on the Brain Web series, it was more of a talk. Matteo gave a talk, I don't know, like it was an 1 hour talk and slides, and obviously there was discussion. And one of the things that we had discussed later, Roberto brought up that maybe we could have a session that we would maybe have a little bit of a presentation or a presentation style or something like that, but we would engage in lots of discussions that sort of where the other presentation left off, or, you know, new topics, new things that we want to discuss today. So very briefly, so that I don't take precious time here of everyone's schedule, let me just briefly introduce the presenters. So Alvaro Moreno is professor of philosophy, and please correct me because I got this from the web, so maybe I got the wrong link, and please correct me. But Alvaro Moreno is professor of philosophy at the University of the Basque Country. And Matteo Mossio is at the Institute of History of the Philosophy of Sciences and Technology at CNRS University, Paris University 1. I don't think Mael is here yet. Is he?
Yeah, I am now also in the Donostia International Physics Center.
Oh, sorry. And what location, please?
San Sebastian.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I was going to introduce Mael Monteville, who is going to be discussing too the points.
No, he's not going to. I guess he's not going to come. He was unable to
come because of the schedule, but maybe he will join us at the end, he said. And also it's my great pleasure to introduce Evan Thompson, who is a good friend and colleague, a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, who will also be discussing, giving counterpoints to the framework that Alvaro Moreno and Matteo Mossio have developed in the past 2 or so decades, but that culminated in the book that we had mentioned before on biological autonomy. So I think, Alvaro, you mentioned that you could start by giving some general points and summarizing at least your position on biological autonomy, which might be slightly different from you and Matteo's, but you want to get started?
Actually, yesterday we talked each other, and we thought that it was more practical and more clear if Matteo starts, and then because what Matteo should say will say is probably the background of my own presentation. So I think it's more complementary if we proceed this way.
Excellent.
Right, Matteo?
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll
so actually,
Matteo.
I'm just recapitulating a few points that I made in my presentation, and Alvaro will follow up with more specific issues about the nervous system and cognition, something that I did not enter too much in my presentation. Actually, just to let you know that, yeah, I make sure that the classics are never that far from my desk. So including, of course, this one. So it's a good habit that I have.
Do you need to share slides by any chance or not?
If you are, I can share. I can share the presentation that I made, because I
can make you co-host. That will give you.
Yeah, thanks.
So you can share at any moment now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what the presentation. And also, I have a comment. If I have understood correctly, the discussion that you are having with Evan is that maybe we are witnesses a sort of paradigm shift in the optimistic in optimistic situation, and usually this paradigm shift take a lot of time. And I heard someone once said that paradigm shift happen when the generation of scientists that advocate as the previous paradigm retire.
Right.
So
right.
that's could take some time.
That's a kinder way of saying it, right, Matteo?
Yeah. Well, I
they
believe
just
it's
retire,
not that
right?
incorrect.
They don't die necessarily.
No, I'm being a bit more charitable. But I think that is not that incorrect. So we can work, but somehow there is inertia there. But this is matter for discussion. So thanks everybody for being here again. Maybe for some of you. Actually, yes, my talk was made on invitation by Roberto at the Institut Pasteur. So I tried to give a sort of overview of some of the central motivations that, in my opinion, are behind the fact of developing a theory, what I call a theory of biological autonomy, that includes also an account of cognitive abilities. And so I'm not remaking the presentation, but one point that I made was that I think that it's useful to understand the theory of autonomy as one of the, in terms of a legacy of the organicist tradition. And this tradition is itself has to be understood as in tension with the mainstream for now several centuries, the mechanistic conception. So this is, oh, I can admit someone now. This gives some coordinates about what the theory of autonomy is supposed to explain and what kind of paradigm is supposed to be in tension with. Or we can discuss about what we mean by mechanism, but globally speaking, I would say that is all the conceptions that firmly rely on the analogy between the organism and machines, with the idea that we can understand the whole by appealing to the parts and not vice versa. And this seems very simple to describe, but it's very profound and very far-reaching. So I cannot move on anymore. Up. Sorry. Yeah. So in contrast to this tradition, there is a long organicist tradition that could be traced back at least to Kant, maybe to Aristotle, but that's the things become a bit more complex, but at least from Kant. Then here you find some names. Varela is particularly interesting because it is at the crossroads between two branches of the theory of autonomy. So the biological autonomy, notably because he formulated the theory of autopoiesis, and then in cognitive science through the idea of enaction and what is now called enactivism as a paradigm account. So there is many issues. One of the motivation of our work on these ideas, actually, this is why I went to San Sebastian to work with Alvaro Moreno as a postdoc, because there is a bunch of people that have tried to work on ideas related to autonomy. And one of the points that for me are very important is that if you want to have a good theory, we have to be clear about what kind of objects this theory deals with, what kind of causal relations, philosophers would say, because you see there is always this typical objection that yes, you deal with circularities, but the world is full of circularities, and so unless you are very precise about what you're talking about, otherwise your theory is too vague and not applicable and not actually operational. So scientists cannot use the theory to make experiments and so on. So one of our motivation is, can we try to be precise, to make specific hypotheses that can be improved or proved to be incorrect? And that's why we elaborated by also relying on this idea that was developed in the Basque Country by Alvaro and his team about the relation between organization and thermodynamics, which itself an idea coming from other people, from Stuart Kaufman. So there's a tradition about that. And so the idea that I had with Vael Monteville was to reinterpret Robert Rosen's idea of closure to efficient causation in terms with which are closer to Stuart Kaufman's idea of the work constraint cycle. And the resulting idea was, maybe we can express closure as a definition of what we mean by biological organization as closure of constraints. That was the central idea. And constraints, we think that it is possible to distinguish two big categories of entities within an organism or a cognitive agent. Constraints, so parts that can be described as having some kind of conservation or conserved property at some relevant time scale, and that because of this conservation are able to act on process interactions and canalize them in specific ways. So the notion is constraints on the one side, which can be defined, this is very important, as specific time scales and processes. And the biological organization is the organization of constraints, is the fact that constraints with construct to what happens in artifacts and machines depend on each other for their ongoing existence. So they maintain each other over time, because if you wait enough, so if you take longer time scale constraints that can be enzymes, the vascular system, or anything to which you can ascribe the function, undergo degradation or and should be rebuilt or repaired. So that's what the organization does. So in a sense, we reinterpreted this idea. This is very, very of self-organization, self-determination that you can find in all these authors in terms of a specific kind of self-constraint that, in our opinion, is something that is workable in scientific terms. But the idea is exactly the same idea. So this is the very abstract schema that we did in that paper, and that we reused in the book with Alvaro. There are many implications that I'm skipping here about how this notion allows talking about teleology, normativity, and function in a way that we found grounded and grounded in a naturalized way, so compatible with the canons of scientific explanation. And there are two implications. One is that it also provides a way to talk about agency. This is something that we did for the first time in the book with Alvaro, by relying on previous work that he did with some of his PhD students. Quickly, agency is the fact that a biological organization has to interact with the external environment, and some of the constraints that are in charge of these interactions ground the agential capacity of the organism in the sense of being in charge of this normative interaction with the external world, which is a necessity because the system is supposed to be thermodynamically open. So it has to interact with the environment so as to maintain itself. So closure has nothing to do with independence or the fact of being isolated from the environment. So it's exactly the opposite. And the other notion is adaptivity, and this is an idea that Ezequiel Di Paolo expressed it for the first time in a very nice and influential paper, where he argued that by criticizing the classical theory of autopoiesis, is that the theory of autopoiesis does not capture a obvious capacity of organisms, which is the fact of being able to adaptively anticipate possible dangers, so to modify its behavior so as to maintain itself alive. So an autopoietic system is either dead or alive, but is not able to anticipate dangers and to behave accordingly. And that's what Ezequiel called adaptivity, which is a notion that we also use and accept in our work, which I'm putting here the definition so that you can see what it's about. So in a sort, it relates to the capacity of a system to regulate its own behavior so as to cope with possible perturbation, internal and external perturbations. And what we try to say in the book is that if a system that is closed in our sense to realize an organizational closure, and is in addition to that is an adaptive agent, is an autonomous system. And more or less, we do not really provide a definition, but autonomous systems could be something that denote what we call, or is a sort of characterization of what we call an organism. So in a sense, we have a lot of systems that could be described as being organized, for instance, organisms, and also, for instance, ecosystems. And some of them have additional capacities as being adaptive agents. In that case, they're autonomous systems, and more or less something that we call organism in everyday life. So that's part of this. Just to recap some of the central notions. One of the important things to do is to try to use these ideas to make models. Otherwise, we cannot test whether these ideas are operational or not. And part of the, and now I leave the stage to Alvaro to develop a bit more the implication of this framework for the cognitive nervous part. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Matteo. Alvaro, would you like to
Yes,
continue?
If you want, I can start from where Matteo has finished with my own considerations. Well, assuming this basic, which of course I share fully with Matteo, this basic framework, complexities or complications began, and I will mention the first one. The first one lies in the very concept of regulation, which is fundamental. Of course, when we see how life, complicated life, colonies, or eukaryotic cells, and even prokaryotic cells works, and forming colonies, forming multicellular organization, forming several levels of organization, acting some of the genes in a given moment when the environment requires changing the metabolic organization. So there are some latent, dormant, so to speak, constitutive forms of organization. And when one asks himself where this norm come from, it's not so easy to say that a normative regulation is something completely self or established by the system itself, in the sense that how a autopoietic system could select a way of behaving that maybe in its own lifetime organization never happens or is never necessary to trigger. And actually, we know that the organizational life is happens at different time scales at a different nested forms of organization. For example, we can probably see the whole evolutionary system as a kind of self-maintaining organization in which there are a very large spatial and intergenerational scale, trial and errors where some constraints are retained because they maintain this global system in which organisms are fundamental nodes. And then we can say that probably at the origin, some of these regulatory norms came from selective processes. Now, this is just for situating that when this basic framework evolves and many different levels of organization and different, so to speak, levels of norm happens. So far, so good. And this is not to say that something different than biological organization is emerging. However, when we consider some form of multicellular integrated body plans occur, and basically, I'm speaking in the origin of Metazoan phylum. And the earlier nervous system appeared, my guess and my hypothesis is that something qualitatively different happens. Why? Of course, the nervous system, everybody probably will agree on that, is a very powerful regulatory level working in the biological organization of the of this type of organism, and is fabricated by this basic biological self-determining organization we call, in this case, a multicellular organism. But at the same time, and this is a very interesting observation, is something that creates a different neurodynamic kind of domain. I will use the term by now, domain. Varela uses the term nervous system autonomy. I will be careful on that. And I will be careful on that because I'm not speaking on that, but I'm speaking on something which is different as other forms of regulatory mechanisms in different either unicellular or multicellular systems like gene networks and many, many other forms of regulatory structures, mechanisms, or networks. Why? First of all, because it's a neurodynamic domain which is completely different. Why is different? It's different because the huge degree of configurations that can adopt and change per unit of time, first of all. Flexibility, plasticity, second. Third, because it's a very interesting system. This is something that I have read in Jablonka and Ginsburg book, that they provide a system in which neurons act as common currencies, in the sense that they translate in a common language very different types of sensorial inputs from the outside of the organism or even from the inside of the organism. And there are also several points that I want to address here that have in the last year developed and commented. One is that, and this is well known, that the nervous system acts regulating not only the form of interactive relationships of the animal, but also the control of the viscera. So it's regulating in a complementary way, and both are sides of the same coin, physiology and agency. Second, is also regulating from the beginning the developmental processes of the animal. This is very interesting fact. For example, even in a system so primitive as Cnidaria, the larva, where there are already some form of nervous organization, controls the migration of this larva, such that if the agential, if the movement of this larva is developing in a different way, or just if we experimentally preclude that the larva is moving, so the consequence is that the animal doesn't develop as an adult. So it's so strong, the relation between the development, physiological process, interactive processes, immune processes, that we enter in a process in which we see how the whole biological organization is, so to speak, sequestered or taken over by this new organization. Except that in the early steps, this organization is not able to self-determine because it's very simple and is genetically specified fundamentally. Yet, in a given moment of the development, when a process of integration inside the very nervous system happens, some neural structures, we have called that neurodynamic structures, which are metastable structure of neurons, of assemblies of neurons, began to appear and began to build a kind of self-maintaining between each other and the interaction of the animal, and also with the control of the viscera, so that a kind of, with some degree of similarity of that happened with the self-maintaining closure of constraints that Matteo have talked about, a very different form of autonomous neurodynamic organization appear. And then when some neurodynamic structures are there that contribute to the maintenance of this neurodynamic organization appear or take place, then we can say that this system self-determines in a similar way. And this self-determination shapes and controls the self-determination, the underlying self-determination of the body, of the physiological development, etc., aspects of the body. Now, this is the way I would speak, or this is the framework, the basic framework in which I will address the question of the emergence of a form of cognitive autonomy that brings forth a type of specific cognitive functions, provided that we are well aware that these functions should not be alien, should not be distinct, should not have a kind of functionality which is in opposition or indifferent of the maintenance of the biological functions. This is important. So I am claiming that this is an autonomous level, not reducible to biological functionality, but is not in opposition, is not alien, is not indifferent to, should not be in opposition or indifferent from with respect to the biological functions of the whole organism. It's better that I stop here and leave some room for the question.
That was fascinating. Lots of ideas there that I would like to see if we can continue our discussion. So, Evan, would you like to go first and say a few things and your impressions and your reaction to these first two presentations, if you want. I mean, otherwise you can maybe just ask a question. I mean, it's really completely free here to, in whatever way it works.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm happy to just very impromptu say some things. So first of all, I just want to say that I think this is the first time, well, it's certainly the first time I've seen Alvaro in a while, and meeting Matteo for the first time in this virtual new world that we inhabit. So I just want to say, for the sake of the record, that I absolutely love the book, the Biological Autonomy book. I think it's an extremely important advance, particularly having seen, some of the development of these ideas in Varela's thinking, over years, to see, these further steps taken, I think is really encouraging, and it's a very powerful framework. And so I just want to, say that for the sake of the record. I've reread the book actually just last week, and because I'm using it for some things that I'm writing now myself, and so I was again very inspired by it. I had read it when it first came out, but then I reread it. So one of the things, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about already just in what both of you have mentioned, but maybe since this is a philosophy neuroscience group, one of the things that interests me to think about is how we might think about, both conceptually and then specifically in terms of models and experiments, apply the closure of constraint framework to thinking specifically about the nervous system, or even the brain. And this, so I'm gonna say something very general first, because I'm interested in getting your reactions on this. This raises for me a very general question, which really has to do with how to think about the difference between a constraint and a process. Because you might say that from the most sort of maximally wide out perspective, process is the overarching notion, and constraint is a subtype of process that really has to do with the difference in time scales, where, for example, in your cases of enzymes in the vascular system, the vascular system, of course, is reciprocally affected in all sorts of ways by the pumping of blood and by oxygenation, but those effects are typically manifested on a slower time scale than on the faster time scale of the processes that it's enabling. So now so that raises a question for me about whether the distinction between constraint and process, how ontologically deep it goes, if I want to put it philosophically, or whether it's more explanatory and heuristic, depending on our particular explanatory frame. And now if I take that idea or question and I move it over to thinking about the nervous system, it seems to me that what we would identify as a constraint or what we would identify as a process very much is going to depend on the spatiotemporal scale the task we might be presenting an animal with. I mean, you can think of, for example, fast, transient, long-term, long-range signaling that forms a fast transient assembly, as you can think of that as both a constraint and a process in relationship to something like, I don't know, a shift of attention or holding something in working memory or perceptual recognition, depending on, the level at which you're analyzing it. So I guess if I try to summarize all that into a question, I'm very interested to hear how, if you have ideas about how you might take this framework over into application to the nervous system, particularly, the nervous system of complex mammals that we study doing complex, cognitive tasks. Because that's where I think you get, if that can be done theoretically, then we start to get some real traction in, say, cognitive neuroscience. And so I'm interested in how you think about that. I realize that's sort of in a way vague in general, but I'm just trying to elicit thoughts about that, really.
Yeah, Matteo, you want to go ahead?
See, I raised my hand. Surely Alvaro has a lot to say. A preliminary response is that for me, the constraint process distinction is a theoretical one, in the sense that this is given by the theory, is one of the framing distinction of the theory. So is a way to make efficient causes workable, because I would have problems in finding efficient causes in the world because they are undefined in Rosen framework. And in Varela, there is no such a distinction. They only components. So components is a bit vague for me. So this is the try. And I agree with you that metaphysically speaking, processes are, so to speak, more fundamental. I have this sort of ontological take. And if you do that, then what if you think that fundamentally everything is a process, then what you have to explain is stability. And so the theory that provides a categorization of constraints is the first step to try to have the good tools to deal with the explanandum, which is why there is some stability if everything is fundamentally a process. That's how I see the relation between metaphysics and theory. And of course, it is true, and this is very important, that constraints are scale dependent. This is a fundamental point, because they are not just there. So they are ontological in the sense that they are the part of the ontology produced by the theory. In the theory of autonomy, you have new objects. Some other objects are probably less meaningful, and these objects become very important. One of these is constraints. So this a sort of preliminary answer, but Luis was.
Yeah, so I actually just wanted to ask you so that I can actually engage others too, but like for a less sophisticated, for a less philosophically sophisticated crowd, and myself included, when you say that, you seem to be implying that there is a real ontological distinction between processes and constraints. So in your overall framework, there's a separate space for them. But is that the correct reading? Because for many of us, would tend to shift to Evan's sort of direction, in which, because there's so much co-determination and so much that is spatial temporally diverse in terms of co-constraining and evolving spatial temporally, that it seems to me that a constraint is a very nice notion from the outside to organize the space of entities, and what is actually going to be investigated in this case is going to be something, a constraint in this context, viewed as a constraint in this context, versus a more real or ontologically or fundamental distinction that you actually draw. This is the part of, this is how I see the world, and the world is separated in terms of these classes of objects, one of which is autonomously constraints. So
okay, this is something I'm giving my own perspective because it's very philosophical. I mean, for me, as a philosopher of science, I do not do too much metaphysics. I do not argue about how the world is in itself. I don't know. What I know is how we build theories, and theories is what provides us with the tools to see the world. So the ontology that I accept is the ontology that is given by a certain theory. The objects that I can manipulate in my head, etc., are those provided by a theory. So if I am a genetic reductionist, the concept, the tools that I put to work are the genes, the program, and this kind of the algorithm, etc., etc. These are the notion that I can use them, and I will try to apply them to describe the world. If you think that theoretical autonomy is meaningful, then you will use these notions, but they are not real in the sense that we could say the world contains constraints in itself. It's our way to make sense of the world. That's why, in my opinion, workable ontologies are those which are produced by theories. So I make a distinction between what I can say within a theory and a discussion about the real world. This is my own way of, but many other philosophers reason a different way. No, that's my own take on that.
Yeah, but in a way, scientists, experimental scientists, usually don't worry too much about some of these issues. But yeah, no, I understand. Alvaro, I think you were going to say something.
He's moving.
Yeah.
First of all, a couple of clarifications or addenda to what Matteo have said. A constraint, I take constraint as epistemological and as ontological, and I will try to clarify what is behind this distinction. On the one hand, constraint physicists, for example, can treat material structure as a constraint for the sake of an explanation. For example, I can treat the wall of a vesicle as a constraint if I'm looking of the dynamics, the trajectories of the molecules inside. On the other hand, if I am trying to study the robustness or the behavior of this vesicle against pH or other parameters, then I would treat that as a structure point. However, and Varela, for example, when he says that a topoietic system is a system in which there is a set of processes of production of components that create a physical border. But this physical border becomes a condition of possibility for the maintenance of these processes. So then it implicitly treats the physical border as a constraint. It's different of our conception in the sense that there is only one constraint. This is a self-maintaining constraint that constrain or harness the processes inside. The processes build the constraint, and the constraint maintains the conditions, the concentration of these processes so as to maintain blah, blah, blah. Of course, we know that a cell is something which is much complicated and that a living system requires many different constraints. A constraint could be treated as a boundary condition, as a parameter, but the fact that certain systems fabricate themselves the constraints that are the condition of possibility for their own maintenance, so to speak, ontologize these constraints, makes that there is not a kind of merely epistemological distinction. It's something that happens, it's a condition of possibility of this kind of system. For example, a living cell. Now, how can I detect what is a constraint in a system? It depends of what is the type of study of the phenomenon that I want to explain, because I can treat constrained processes as a basic processes that are constrained for a higher level. It depends on what I want to explain. For example, if I try to explain developmental processes, then what I'm really interested is in the intercellular constraints, and the dynamics between the cells, the growth, etc., are treated as a basic processes that are harnessed. Now, in the case of the nervous system, also there have many levels of regulation, and some cases there are patterns of neural processes that are just acting as a constraint for physiological processes, full stop. And this is nothing to do with I have to do recently to explain it. What matters for my purpose is when in a relatively primitive nervous system, there happens that some functional neural structures constrain each other so as to maintain a global functional process at the neurodynamic level. For example, and this is a case that I have studied with a colleague of mine, Argyris Arnelos. We have considered that in the case of some cnidaria that have eyes, the cubozoan cnidaria, the sensorial processes in the eyes, in some of the eyes, take more time because there is a process of integration in the sense that they create an integrated pattern which correspond with an image, what we call an image, which has some properties that make them a different, qualitatively different than just what other medusae like Aglantha digitalis, Lacinice, has during his tactile or other type of sensorial mechanism. Why? Because this can be experimentally studied. I think we cannot have the opportunity here for time reasons to present or to describe all that in detail. But I think that empirically, if we define very clearly what we want to study, we can decide whether there is some phenomena is a process or should be treated as a constraint.
Yeah. May I?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I want to make sure that I take some of the questions here that were in the chat. And Roberto asks, could constraints in a mammalian nervous system be, for example, the development of cytoarchitectonic organization, or perhaps the setup of the visual cortex, first autonomously and then in coupling with visual experiment? Another example, something like episodic memory. So in the context of the nervous system, are those constraints, or how should we understand this type of, I guess it's fairly heterogeneous here because it went from development all the way to episodic memory, but
so Roberto, please ask simple questions. And
let's choose.
It can be made simple. Like if I were like very concretely trying to build a model from the biological autonomy perspective, and I wanted to make this thing work, right? So a process would be probably implemented as a function, and then this function would be probably the equivalent of the constraint, but at some point I will have to create a process that will produce that function. if I'm correct. So at some point, even within the biological autonomy theory, I will have to treat a constraint as some sort of a process when I want to build a function.
Yeah,
that'd be correct.
Yeah.
Because any constraint is a dual entity, is a constraint at some time scale, is a constraint. So yes, as some conservation, some conserved property that allows you to say that this constraint is canalizing some process. But a different time scale is the product of a set of other processes. So at the other time scale is not a constraint. So any entity has this double status in the theory. So you have to try to give some elements of answer to Evan's question. You have to discriminate when you make a model. If you say, well, I want to apply the theory of autonomy to make a model, the first thing is that you have to isolate the processes on which constraints operate. So you need to specify, to find the process that you want to explain. When you explain, meaning explain why this process has a specific behavior rather than being just under physics and chemistry. So how the organism is canalizing the process. So this is what you want to explain. And you try to detect, to find what is the one or the set of constraints that actually explain why this process has the dynamic that it has. And then you try to close the loop. So not only you have this idea of looking for the constraints, but also to explain how the system or the subsystem has its own coherence. And that implies making the loop, giving at least a sub-closure that explains why a set of constraints actually manage to maintain each other or maintain this dynamic in a stable way. So you have different steps and different problems: finding the processes, the target processes, finding timescales, finding the constraints, finding the dependencies among at least some of the constraints. So locating each constraint in a system, which is part of the work. Otherwise, you are just looking at the specific subsystem. So the additional idea of closure, at least, is to locating each functional constraint in a system. And that's the very complex challenge of autonomy, which is, in my view, the general challenge of any organicist perspective, actually.
But
Alvaro.
you said a word that for treating a mass of processes as a constraint, you have a selective forget of the details, because this whole mess of processes behave with respect to some environmental trajectories of particles or microscopic processes as a whole entity that causally harness this process. And when there is a set of self-maintaining constraints, then you get some minimal form of autonomy. Then is where is nothing purely epistemological, a choice of the observer, but something that has power, because some form of self-determination appears. The word self-determination, Matteo, you remind our yesterday discussion, is maybe very clear instead of the use of the word autonomy for some type of explanations. Self-determination.
Okay. There's a question by Nicholas Wilkinson. Nicholas, do you want to ask your question, or you prefer that I ask?
Hello, Nicholas. Please step in.
It's
not there.
Maybe. Okay. So it's.
Hello?
Hello,
Hi.
we can hear you.
Hello, I'm on a train, so my connection is quite bad, and it's probably better if you proxy for me, please.
Okay, I will do that, no problem. That's
Thank you.
okay. Sure. So, okay, so the question has two parts. well, no, actually has two clauses, I guess. So one, is the mother-fetus system an example of co-homeostasis? Two, is the closure of a fetus?
What is the
you can see Alvaro, you can see the question in the chat. You can read the question in the chat. Question by Nicholas Wilkinson.
Okay, the chat.
I'll read it. So is the mother-fetus system an example of co-homeostasis? Two, is the closure of a fetus complete with the mother via the umbilical, via the umbilical cord, for instance? If one is yes and two is no, it's a little, you have to write down. Like,
I said simple questions.
So basically the question is co-homeostasis a challenge to the primacy of autonomy? So the question is, when there's a reciprocal co-relationship, does it pose a challenge to autonomy?
You mean an example of symbiosis, for example?
Yeah.
I think so. I think that would be an example, for instance. Yeah, but I guess it's more than symbiosis. Could be other kinds of relationships. Yeah. What kinds of relationships, I guess, would challenge autonomy, I guess, or not be a challenge, and for what reasons?
Well, the organization of life at so many levels and the nested relationship between different forms of organization raises a lot of paradoxes and a lot of questions. I don't think that it challenges the basic idea of autonomy, because if we drop this idea, everything loses the sense, in my view, in our view, I think. But on the other hand, it is true that as formulated is more for pedagogical clarity, because in practice, we have to introduce a lot of nuance, a lot of complexifications. For example, this case of, which is practically so widespread that it's hard to imagine something which is not playing in this sense. You have a system, which is an autonomous system, and you have another one. And they both, the first one turns out that produce some component that is necessary for the realization of the autopoiesis of the second, and vice versa. So it's not a parasitic case. And this could create a degree of complementarity that there is a transition between two temporal collaboration towards a kind of collaboration in which no anymore any of these two systems could perdure, could live independently, and towards a third case in which there is such degree of integration that there is any more two different individuals. Now, here we have many challenges, conceptual challenges. What is an individual? Because the concept of autonomy implies a self, a norm for a kind of organization. Then you have to specify for which organization something is beneficial. And for example, if a bacterium parasites me, what is good for the bacterium, functional for the bacterium, is dysfunctional for me. In the case of the symbiosis or the co-homeostasis, things are different. But in the case of the full integration, things can change. And how is this transition, for example, which we know that happens along the history of life? So there are a lot of things that we have to think over.
If I may, I perfectly agree with Alvaro. That's quite annoying, actually, because I don't think that this is a challenge to the theory in the sense that it challenges the concept of autonomy. Because even though we have two systems that actually depend on each other for their maintenance, then the question would be how many systems do we have, and not whether there is or not autonomy, because we are saying that this system work to their own maintenance, they work to their own self-determination. So insofar as there is self-determination, the theory seems to be applicable to make sense. Then the question is, how many systems, how we parse our world, how many systems do we have there? And then the question is true that it's very common, because probably there is a continuum in the degree of interactions and dependency between systems. In the paper with Mael in 2015, in the last part, we deal with this case in the most simple case. So suppose that you have a weak symbiosis, meaning that you have two organisms and they share some functions. And so in that case, which is presumably a quite widespread case. So in that case, there is a way to quantify the dependencies and say, well, each organism contains a huge degree of functional complexity, because most of the functions are internal to the system, and they share some functions. So you can actually, with this sort of discontinuity, this difference between being weakly connected to each other and strongly integrated, or each on its side, you can draw the boundary, because you can show that actually there is a weak degree of integration between two systems. So the two organisms are peak of functional complexity, whereas the interaction is weak. So this is one example of how we can organize our individuals in this specific case. But Alvaro is correct. There is everything in nature, so there will be cases where this discontinuity is not that clear, because the systems are so integrated that we hesitate where we have one or two or three systems. And that seems to me
eukaryotic cell. An eukaryotic cell.
An eukaryotic cell. Yeah. Correcto.
Roberto.
You are mute.
So a simple question. So there's this potential challenge or like something that would require further clarity, that would be how one biological autonomous system can become two in the case of the mother and the fetus, or that several cells can become an organism. But and then there's what you were mentioning, this sort of weak links between different biological autonomy systems. But would it also be a biological system, a biologically autonomous system, emerging inside another biological system? Could that be the case, for example, of a mind? Is the mind some sort of autonomous biological system that it's created within the other? So there would be like having one close to the other, or many interacting together, but also probably one within another.
If I may, Alvaro will certainly answer that, but if I may, one clarification. Of course, the question whether you have how many autonomous systems you have when they interact supposes that there is codependence. Because if the dependence is one way, as in parasitism, for instance, then you do not have global closure, because the dependency is only one way. So we are speaking about the case where you can prove the dependency is both sides. So the question would be in what sense mental the mind would make a contribution to biological autonomy. It's precisely the point that Alvaro was making, because the question here is that we have two options, and as far as I can tell, this is unsettled in the enactive autonomy literature. The mainstream idea is that cognition is part of life, in the sense that if you have life, you have cognition, which seems to mean that cognition is a function of life, contributes to life. Or you have the minority thesis, which is also one of Alvaro's students that Matt made, and also Ezekiel has made this explicit, that one, you have cognition has its own autonomy. Meaning that when the intuition is that when you play chess, you are not contributing to biological autonomy. You are contributing to the sensory motor habit, which is playing chess, whatever the metabolism is requiring. So you are forgetting the So you see, I'm caricaturing a bit the idea, but the idea that if you have mental life, then mental life is a different regime of autonomy that has its own purpose. I personally hesitate between the two. But of course, the question, how do we study cognition with these tools, requires also making an hypothesis of what is the function of cognition. Because either you say that it's like controlling viscera, more or less. So cognitive skills are functions, biological functions, or you make a more stronger hypothesis, a difficult hypothesis, which is cognitive autonomy is mental life. And this can be something completely different. So that's something that Alvaro was mentioning before.
Well, I'm not recognize myself in any of these two positions, because my own position, I know that it's difficult to explain, but is that mental life is emergent, is not reducible to biological autonomy, but at the same time is fundamental, is something that contributes to some type of biological organism, multicellular organism, in which they create this system that at the same time makes them strongly individually, strongly integrated, different than other forms of life, and endow them with a kind of complex forms of agency, among other things, a complex form of bodies, and reshape and opens a kind of new forms of biological organization because it creates an additional form of self-determination.
Evan. I think you're muted still.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so responding to these, two different tendencies in active thinking that Matteo mentioned in relation to what we're talking about, I think so first thing I would say is I think it's important that we don't get caught up in a verbal dispute. And when you read some authors and they use the word cognition and they say, like the way Maturana did originally, said living is a cognitive process, the nervous system doesn't create it, the nervous system enlarges the cognitive domain. I mean, if you then ask what he means by cognition there, he says something like, in behavior that involves some kind of, inductive prediction of a niche. So very, very kind of general sense of predictive behavior. Francisco later on, in order to try to clarify things, you can maybe dispute whether this actually does clarify things, but he preferred to say that living is a matter of sense making, and then he would restrict the use of the word cognition to the particular kind of sense making that you get when you have a nervous system. So, we can use the words however we want. That's not so much my point. It's just we need to make sure that we're not talking at cross purposes. So, within the framework of your book, you use, words like normativity and function and agency for the interactive dimension of autonomy. And that's in a way what Varela meant by sense making. And then you use cognition more restrictedly for the kind of autonomy that we get with sensory motor autonomy. So that's just kind of like, let's just be clear how we're using the words. Now, there are more substantive questions, though, that I think are actually really difficult. So one of them is, take the chess playing example. Well, there is a sense in which, sure, playing chess, and chess is a formal game, so it's an easy example. Playing chess is a kind of cognitive skill that you don't understand, both, of course, in terms of the rules of chess and then in terms of implementing them, cognitively. in terms of metabolism, for example. So it's clearly at a different level of intelligibility and description. However, if my life is about chess playing and I'm imprisoned or I'm denied the possibility to play chess, it's going to have severe metabolic implications. So now what's the relationship there? Well, I mean, that's an extremely difficult question in psychology and in biology. How do we analyze that? So we need to leave open exactly, even if we distinguish, cognitive capacities at that level of sensory motor, and then even more complex than just mere sensory motor. In the case of chess, we distinguish those from metabolic processes. We still have a very difficult question about the complex interdependencies. So that's one question. Then the second question that I think is really difficult, and it's not an a priori question, is whether you can bypass metabolic instantiation, or so that is to say a certain kind of thermodynamic instantiation, whether you can bypass that and implement or realize sensory motor or cognitive autonomy, self-determination. Could you have a self-determining system, a full-blown self-determining system in the constraint closure sense at a sensory motor level, or further at a richer cognitive level, without it being grounded in a self-maintaining, self-regulating, self-generating, self-perpetuating metabolic system? Is that possible? So, I mean, it is the hypothesis in certain domains of robotics that it is possible. It's not obvious to me that it is, though, because if you can only get, value, function, normativity out of a certain kind of thermodynamic implementation with all the demands that come from that, adaptivity, precariousness, and so on, then you're not going to be able to get meaning and normativity at a purely sensory motor level or at a purely cognitive level. So I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think it's actually the question that that is at the heart of what we're talking about here, the relationship between the metabolic level of autonomy and the sensory motor and the cognitive level.
May I? Very interesting question. Suppose we have in a petri dish a culture of neurons, and we build a complex enough network that connects itself, etc. How can this network create functions in the sense that they make some contribution to the maintenance of this system? It's not so easy to think what could be a function or how this system could bring forth a open-ended space of functions if it is not embodied in an organism. Which is the interactive aspect that could, so to speak, affect the maintenance of this system in a sense that is not trivial, for example. Besides, we know that a nervous system is a system that is so embodied in the metabolic organization because the cells are multiplying during the process of development. They change the dendrites, etc. They depend on many metabolic aspects in so important aspects of the architecture that it's really hard to imagine, even implemented that in a robot, how can, in at least a very far way, to imitate what happens in a biological nervous system. And this is important, very important, because when we think on how to this functionality that we know is so fundamental in order to maintain, to keep, imagine this, the maintenance of these patterns why a given pattern is maintained unless this is because it contributes to other patterns, etc. And why this is getting more complex and complex? Because make something for what? So it's important to think in this way in this way, because otherwise we will go, in my view, to dead ends conceptual concerning the functionality of this system.
I really hesitate about this, because of course there is a sense in which what you are saying, what Evan was mentioning about the fact that if I am a professional chess player and I cannot play for some reason, there will be physical consequences of that. So I think that we all agree that there is some biological rooting of even very abstract cognitive abilities. But I would not, so I do not disagree with that. But in a sense, I would not be happy with a theory that is unable to catch what Evan was mentioning, so that when we play chess for the sake of playing chess. And this notion has to be made clear in the theory, and it is not the case. So I'm not playing chess as I eat bread. If the explanation is too similar, there is a sort of underdetermination of the explanation. I mean, we are under explaining the phenomenon, because it is. I think that you agree that there is something about a relative autonomy of this behavior that requires a specific explanation. So we have two competing forces here. The fact of not detaching too much cognitive abilities from the organism, but at the same time, the fact that at least some cognitive abilities, maybe not that many, but some of them are abstract enough, are self-determining enough to require specific explanation. And I still have problems in figuring out how do we set the stage. I don't know what you think. Luis is thinking something.
I think this is I'm just going to point something out here, which is, I think this is an excellent point, Matteo, and it requires explaining that we don't want it to be exactly the same as having bread, eating bread, or what have you. But I think there's also a fundamental aspect that goes to what psychologists and neuroscientists talk in terms of some kind of motivational component, broadly construed, that somehow is important for organisms, animals, humans to act, right? So there is, in one sense, some views in which all behavior is motivated behavior, and in the lack of some motivation in that sense, then there's action and movement literally ceases, right? So sometimes there are these incredible cases of people with so-called akinetic mutism, with lesions of medial prefrontal cortex and whatnot, and it's a huge. We don't know what to make of their report, but if we go by their report and we ask, and they're perfectly capable of moving, and if you ask them, why don't you move? For them is like, the way they express it is, what's the point? I mean, why? I just don't, I don't move because I don't want to. I mean, there is no reason for me to move, right? So I'm not trying to say that motivation is in that little spot, or I'm not claiming that at all, but I'm saying that in some essence, playing chess is very different, and it requires some, I agree, some explanation that elaborates that difference. But at the same time, there's something broader that is shared in this sort of motivational context, affective motivational context that permeates all behavior.
Yeah, actually,
So,
I was thinking, we had this kind of discussion with Alvaro last week, and I was thinking that maybe one of the notion that is still lacking in the theory of autonomy is a notion of, I mean, a workable notion of need, something like that. Something that explained that, wait, we could play chess or play tennis or sleep or something, but having a broader notion that explains why we perform some behaviors that are not strictly speaking maintaining me as a biological unit. Maybe yes, but this broader way of doing that requires additional notions, in my opinion, something a bit more precise. Well, we have a nervous system. This nervous system is doing things, we move, and we have to satisfy some kind of need. This is something quite intuitive to me, but is, you see,
right, right. And this is the fascinating aspect, right? Because it's not about just moving, but it becomes, given our cultural, intellectual upbringing, it becomes, we spend an hour here, 2 hours, 3 hours moving in some other non-motoric, though I'm moving a lot motoric, but moving in some other mental sphere, right? And actually, some of us, at least, afterwards will feel like, oh, that was very fulfilling. Hopefully some of you, that was very fulfilling. I'm going to even watch it again. And so I think that it is, I would agree, reading your book, it's really fantastic. I do think, and I haven't read the whole series of papers, obviously, that is from which it's actually has the deeper arguments. But again, if the way you're stating it in terms of a theory of need or a conceptualization of need, I really think is fundamental in explaining how these simultaneous needs exist, right? Maybe someone is getting really tired because it's very late there in Europe, or someone is very hungry because they had to skip breakfast somewhere in the West Coast or something like that, that they're co-occurring, right? And I think that this theory, this aspect is hugely important.
Yeah, I agree.
But if you have a very complex nervous system with a complex brain, for example, and you have to perform some activities in a conscious way that requires a very high power of integrating a lot of information and integrating with value system, etc., etc. Okay, then probably at this level of organization, for example, playing some games, and this is something that we see in most of the mammals, if not all of them, is something that is probably need, not this way or this other particular way, that could depend, but is a tool or is a process which is necessary for developing in the right way these capacities. So the more complex the capacities, probably the most kind of apparent and useless form of activities are required, just because otherwise the whole behavior probably goes pathologically in one sense or another. And the result is a lack of flourishment of your capacities. And in fact, you need much more capacities to perform just avoiding predators, getting food, etc., that say a worm.
Mm-hmm.
And in your capacities, game, for example, is something that plays a role. It may be for learning, this is something that neuroscientists and psychologists study. But I'm not saying that is something that is completely separated from the self-constitution and self-maintenance of your complex form of way of life, which depends on rationality, on consciousness, etc., which is not the case for the worm. The same that the case of a plant is less complex for the maintenance than the worm, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't want to keep people too long because I can stay here longer, but it's almost an hour and a half. If people want, there are a couple more questions, or we're just going to have to regroup as we feel the need in the future. So I'm of two minds here. I don't want to necessarily push people too late there in Europe. What do we do? I'm sorry?
Now, for me, it's okay. I don't know how many people are from Europe here, but
okay, so let's
even if-
continue a little bit then, because then I want to give the voice to a few people that have asked some questions. There is a question by Peter Mollman that I would rather you ask, Peter, because I don't think I understand the question. I mean, I can read it, but so do you want me to?
I think I had a couple of remarks, but it's just one question, and I think Alvaro Moreno gave the answer or said the same. That was my question. Could chess not be a derivative for the organism of hunger proper? It may be difficult words to ask the same question you answered, that there must be something that's fundamental for that organism to play chess, isn't it? Or is that different?
Is a question for me?
Yeah. Sorry.
No. What I'm saying is probably not necessarily playing chess, but in fact I don't play chess. But some form of play, of intellectually biased play, game, I think is not strictly necessary, because we know that there are people that is, this is something that if you permit me to quote Aristotle. Aristotle said, well, you have the possibility to realize yourself as a rational man, and flourish, and you have some capacities, but these capacities depend on what you are doing. So these capacities give you the possibility to act in a way, but if you don't act in this way, you undermine these capacities. So it's this idea of self-maintenance. So you are something that gives you the capacity to do things, but these things in the same time self-constitute yourself. So we are self-constituting, and we can self-constitute ourselves as more rational beings or less rational beings, as more complete beings or less complete beings, as pathological beings or not. And it depends in what we do. And it's very complex. We have different possibilities, but if we don't read a book, we don't discuss any intellectual thing, we undermine our capacities. And this undermining could go to a pathological level. And ultimately, if this was collectively spread, then we will losing our capacities as human beings. This is the kind of answer that I can give to this question.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is another question here that I want to see, but let's see if we can translate, because it's perhaps a little specific, because it's from a person who uses MRI data and is interested in schizophrenia or other multiple personality disorders. So Nicholas, would you like to ask the question, or should I you prefer that I ask?
Yeah, I can give it a go.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah, my day job is MRI data analyst, but I come from bioinformatics and started reading some of all of y'all's work, and really inspired me. So thank you for having me and having such a great talk. But yeah, I guess how it links to my work directly in MRI and resting state is how does, and I don't work too much with schizophrenia, but I work in psychiatry. So I'm just wondering, how do these different neural assemblies kind of compete with each other to form different minds? And kind of along the previous discussion is, how does this pathological kind of autonomies that are creating more or less minds that have to deal with the same amount of space, if that makes sense.
So you mean in the sense of creating somewhat independent minds from one body, if you will?
Yeah, in the case of multiple personality disorder.
Right, to the extent.
Could we make sense of this situation as a sort of multi-stable autonomous dynamics? I mean, there are at least two stable regimes.
Yeah, right.
And the system, no, I have no idea, but it intuitively could be something like that. I mean, the fact that there are at least two regimes which are stable for a while, and then I don't know for what reason. I'm completely ignorant about this mechanism, but could produce a shift. So, and where most people have one main dynamic here, some people could have multiple ones. I don't know. I have never thought about that, but
yeah,
why not? Would be even competing. Yeah. Actually, my wife is a psychiatrist, but I have never discussed the matter with her.
There you go.
Maybe I should.
There is a. Yeah, that seems like quite a challenging question, but Evan might have either another question or maybe a take.
It's in a way, it's another question, but it's related. So it's a take as well, I suppose. So one of the things that strikes me here in this discussion about, the relationship of mind and self-determining systems is that if we take the closure of constraint model of autonomy, we have a rigorous way of talking about function. So for example, we say, the function of the heart is to pump blood. I realize that's simplistic, but I'm just going to use it as an example. Anyway, the function of the heart is to pump blood because among the causal consequences of the heart, that one directly contributes to constraint closure, whereas the thumping sounds that it makes doesn't contribute to constraint closure. So it's a side effect. So we can actually, we specify function in terms of the constraint closure architecture. So now that's all at a biological level. But now if we're going to start talking about cognition and cognitive function, for example, in the way that people talk about the function of the salience network or the functions of the default mode network, or the functions of the frontoparietal control system, like take your favorite sort of, thing that is talked about in neuroimaging attempts to individuate brain functions in relationship or brain systems in relationship to cognitive function. The talk of function there is problematic, cognitive function, because if we're thinking that function needs to be grounded rigorously in a constraint closure way, then we can't really talk about cognitive function unless we have a constraint closure map at the cognitive level, right? We can attribute functions from the outside, in a sort of loose way of talking, but really that's just kind of a sort of loose shorthand for certain kinds of causal regularities that are salient to us that we pick up on either in correlational studies or in studies where we may, intervene and manipulate things in a certain way to see what the outcomes are, but it doesn't ground the attribution of function. So if we're thinking about how the constraint closure framework works for cognitive neuroscience, where we understand cognitive neuroscience as an attempt to bridge the neurobiology of the brain to the cognitive functions that the brain makes possible, we can't actually do that unless we have some model of the constraint closure for cognition that gives us a handle on what the functions, properly speaking, are. So I wonder if you think that's right. And by you, I mean, Matteo and Alvaro, but also like Luis, as someone who's working in this domain as a neuroscientist, whether you think that makes sense and whether you think that could actually, like, could we develop a program, a research program to do that, to, you know, to map the constraint closure for cognitive function in a way that is biologically significant. I mean, can be understood as biologically instantiable. That was long-winded. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I'm gonna let them answer, but I also want to just
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you one aside, and then maybe I'll come back to. But like, what occurred to me, and maybe I'll have to rethink this. But so, for instance, let's make the example that Evan gave is the heart, right? So okay, I lose my heart and I can't pump, and obviously there's survival there, but so if I lose my heart, it won't pump anymore. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm not saying the brain works that way, but let's suppose a little patch of the brain or some other combination that is kind of a network or something, like it's affected and it can't function, like it stops, like the way that the brain stopped, the heart stopped. And given that stopping, I cannot pay attention to the world in certain ways that I was able before. Some loud sound that that bring my attention doesn't do that anymore, or something like that. So as Evan was saying that, and saying that we can't do that for the heart because we can't speak reasonably or meaningfully about the function of the heart because of the conceptualization in terms of closure and describing it that way. But I guess my question is, and I'm not necessarily subscribing to that at all. I'm just trying to see in what way is it different than if I lose, well, let me just say, if I lose this patch of the brain, I can't see anymore. If I lose the occipital part of my brain, I'm going to be legally blind. So yeah, I'm just trying to see in what way we need to differentiate that as neuroscientists so that we don't fall into some traps about the function of things and so on. But
right.
Yeah.
So it's pretty easy for sensory systems, comparatively easy. I'm not so sure it works so well when we're in the domain of thought, memory, endogenous attention.
I completely agree.
Maybe,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
you know, that's
Yeah.
more what I was thinking.
Yeah. I don't know if Matteo or Alvaro want to say something about Evan's point, and Matteo was going to say something.
Yeah, also, but but I keep thinking.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, yes, that's precisely the issue. The question is, if we talk about functions, cognitive function, and the fact that this behavior is goal-directed and there are norms, all this language that we use, and I think we are entitled to use in biology at large and in cognition, then we have to provide a justification. And the idea is that if we think that the theory of autonomy has something to say, then the fundamental justification is that we can associate this behavior to some kind of self-determining system, closure constraints. The question is, how do we proceed when dealing with highly cognitive functions? That's the point. So that's what we were discussing. I would just to mention that one could say, well, but there is no reason why this notion should apply to the cognitive domain. Maybe it's just something else. We need a different theory. Yes, but one of the philosophical points in self-determination is Kant's point. So this is a naturalized way of dealing with purpose, functions, and norms. And I challenge anyone to find a different justification which would not make any reference to self-determination, because there are no many, either we just reject these notions and we come back to a sort of reductionist mechanistic account, which is legitimate, or we find an alternative justification of norm, function, etc. And I don't know of many other options. So it's also a question of, if we think that this notion can be naturalized, then these ideas, the precise definition can be discussed, but this idea of purpose and norms arise when we are dealing with a system that contributes to its own condition of existence, whatever level we are discussing, is a fundamental question. And that's why I think that it's worth trying to make this work, in my opinion. Alvaro.
Yeah, first of all, and stressing what you, Matteo, have said, this is more a question of providing a conceptual, philosophical, theoretical framework than providing a tool for models. I think that no biochemist or molecular biologist is able to produce a model of the closure of constraints even in a bacteria, in a prokaryotic cell, because it's so complicated. There are so many levels and there are so many kind of constraints that nobody will provide a kind of model of that. It's just a kind of theoretical account for explaining or grounding notions. As for the level of the nervous system, I think that the same tools are valid. When I'm trying to speak in terms of constraints and processes there, and saying that in a way should happen some form of closure, is because either there is a closure or we have an infinite regress. There is no intermediate point. Now, if in a given moment of the development or the evolution of brains or nervous system, there are neural structures endogenously created that constrain other neurodynamic processes, which is clear that happens. And some of them are producing others. And we have either the possibility that this is a line, and this has a beginning and an end in another part. So then we don't have functions, we don't have constraints at the level of the neurodynamic level, or either that there is some loop in a given point that probably depends on other processes, etc. But we have some form of closure. And probably what we can find in models are local forms of closure, which of course will depend on the interaction of external behavior, which of course will depend also on the constraints or the language of the nervous system with the viscera. And we know that both arrows play a role. So the loop is not something that happens only at the level of the nervous system. But once the nervous system creates a network of constraints, then we have the same explanation that we have provided for the metabolic organization. There is some form of self-determination, because otherwise we cannot speak in terms of function whatsoever.
Yeah, it makes sense. It is challenging to wrap one's head around, but yeah. But Roberto, you wanted to ask, make a point or ask a question? We can't hear you.
It's probably to some extent just rephrasing what Alvaro was saying, but the discussion reminded me to some a little bit the classic Turing paper, right? On the building a chess playing machine, and so of course, if we had to build the whole network of closure of a human cognition in order to apply the biological autonomy ideas to human cognition, like, we are doomed, right? And that would be like trying to create like probably the classic artificial intelligence program of building a fully finished cognition that would be able to play chess, for example. But then at the end of the paper, Turing would propose that it probably a different alternative would be to focus more on development. So not to really, probably the entry point for making a concrete application in neuroscience of biological autonomy would be more in trying to create the system that would be able to produce the functions more than to try to mimic the functions that we all know, like language, vision, etc., etc. No, and I thought that it was funny that it's probably already the idea present in this Turing paper.
Yeah, I agree. I would also like to ask, like, to some extent, I think of these general ideas that circulate in this literature. Agency, closure, sense making, etc. A bunch of central notions play the role of a sort of theoretical coordinates. So, and then what you do is not producing a complete theory, but models, local models that create a theory because they share central notions. So you see, Darwin had formulated the theory of evolution, which is quite simple to express. But then what happens is that you have a huge amount of models that create a theory because they share this set of notions. So the idea of providing full explanation of organisms is not the point, but you can have models that actually connect to each other because they share a central set of notions. And the challenge is to have a set of notions on which we can discuss. They move, they change because we constantly revise the theory, but we should agree to some extent so that we are talking about the same thing, that we share the same theory actually. So there's a sort of trade-off between discussions and agreement on central notions. So that's how I see these notions. But we have to discuss about development, but I guess it would be a different session of discussion because it's a very complex issue in itself.
So, for instance, one I guess if maybe last question or maybe one last round of discussion. So, if we think about the kinds of themes that we're discussing here, in what way can we try to, and it goes back to Evan's very first point about models and even Matteo's point about models before. So, in what way can we try to bring things a little closer, in the sense that not have this strong insulation of schools of thinking, of thought, and that barely talk to each other, and sort of, how can we grow closer? I mean, what can be done that would be inspirational in both directions, like inspirational to the theoreticians and inspirational in terms of the more traditional neuroscience or biology more generally, of course, investigators. So what would be some suggestions maybe from some of you that in the panel that are hopefully have thought a little bit about that, or maybe not?
I did, and I think that if you want that a theory to be developed, you need many people working on that theory. So it's obvious. So the question is, if the only way to move forward is to build a sort of interdisciplinary community that work together, and that makes all sort of, we have to develop the theory, the philosophy, the connection with the experimental setups. This is something very, very poorly developed. How do we concretely apply this idea to make experiments, and also fundamentally to make models, to try to make models, even with existing data, to reformulate what is described in different frameworks with these tools. What does it change if we provide a different explanation of existing phenomena? So I would say just the most important thing would be to have interdisciplinary collaborations, so as to check, because of course the theory is going to change as soon as tentative of modeling are done. So we realize that something is missing in theory, and so we go back to the theory, and so on and so on. So for me, this is there are many things that can be done, but this would be the most important, most urgent.
And by modeling, you mean computational mathematical modeling? Is that what you mean? Or
it could be computational, it could be just providing explanations of specific phenomena based on these ideas, rather than on, I don't know, genetic programs. Let's say
right. Theoretical, including,
yeah. So it could be more or less formal, could be more computational.
Right.
It's just a model of explanation of some phenomenon, centered on these ideas rather than other ideas. What does that change? And there are very few tries about that. So we made one with Ana Soto about how do we explain the glycemia, the regulation of glycemia in mammals.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We made one try, but it's not formal. It's just we redescribe what happens in when you apply feedback loops compared to constraint closure.
Right, redescriptions.
Yes, that could be made formal or even more complex.
Right.
But the question is, what does that change? People that do know instinctively agree or do not know about these ideas want to know what does that change.
Exactly.
How is changing the explanation of this phenomenon, that phenomenon, that phenomenon?
Absolutely. Yeah, Alvaro?
In my case, maybe I will surprise a little bit you. I was much more worried about how we can explain the different trends in multicellularity, how the development, the body plans are in a way in such cases, in a different way in others, and why, for example, the Cambrian explosion can be explained, and what is behind all that, which are the consequences, why in some multicellular there is an explosion in the complexity of the forms of agency. This kind of questions are the ones that I'm more interested or more focused in explaining. And I have developed these ideas in order to explain or in order to understand this kind of phenomena rather than providing models for such and such psychological or mental question. Really, humbly speaking, I have not worked in this direction. I have not pretended when speaking in this sense or when providing this framework, build some models. Maybe I'm wrong, but this my own goal was this one.
Thank you, Alvaro. Evan. Sorry, go.
Sorry, just to say that, of course, I'm mostly a philosopher of science, but I feel that I have also to have to be more and more engaged in this interdisciplinary work, because otherwise it would be very difficult to make the theory advance and convince more people that is worth working on.
Right, exactly. That's how a lot of us feel. Yeah. Evan, would you like to your take about the bridges?
Yeah, I mean, my take is very similar. I think developing the theory, I think models both with the existing data and then also with appropriate people thinking of experiments that would be motivated by such a framework would be interesting. I mean, just like as a historical example, it seems commonplace to us now in neuroscience, this idea of, so-called top-down activity modulating feed-forward or bottom-up activity. That just seems like an everyday notion now, but 40 years ago, it wasn't, and it was motivated by people who said no, like Varela and Wolf-Singer, they said, no, the brain has this architecture that clearly has to do with, a kind of closed loop of activity. And if that's the case, then we should be able to, flip things and look at how, stimulus modulation is dealt with as a function of ongoing endogenous activity. And that's just every day now, but that came out of thinking of the nervous system in terms of closure. So ideas like that, really thinking, okay, so what kinds of experiments or different ways of probing, the brain or whatever biological system would be appropriate in light of this way of thinking. I think that's really crucial.
That is a perfect example, because nowadays it's very, in a way, entertaining to hear discussions of people that cannot even understand how it was any way different. So when some of us who are older bring up these things, but everyone says, yeah, but that's obvious, everyone knows that. And so it's both satisfying and a little irritating. But I guess it's what progress does, right? We are so beyond
this is the danger, right? You propose, alternative ideas and other ways of looking at things, and then they become co-opted and everybody thinks, well, that's what we thought all along. I mean, we see that in the history of the organicism mechanism debate, right? You know, where the mechanists just absorb certain critiques that at the time were actually very powerful, and then they absorb them, they go on, and then they talk as if they had always known that. I mean, this is
in a way, the sense that in which they lose their power is really an indication, right? They seem such weak points because it's so obvious. Like all you had in the 91 book, I mean, it's just okay, yeah, but we knew that. Well,
right.
Sure. We know now. Well, I like to thank everyone for your patience and your endurance of this session. Really, huge thanks to everyone, and I would be very much looking forward to finding ways to enhance the communication and move forward with large interdisciplinary groups that hopefully can make some progress, and be delighted to be helping and involved in any way possible. So
count on me for that.
All right.
Me too.
Great.
Also,
Okay. Okay, everyone. So I'm going to end the session here. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
thank you to all of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.